Dude, I'm making no fast, super healthy, vegan chili.
Nice. A little trouble, folks.
Focus. Focus.
Can't cook without your beer.
Absolutely not. So essentially what we're going to do is we're going to caramelize and toast some garlic and onions as a base for the soup. So really we're just going to be making a fancy broth, and then we're going to puree that with an immersion blender, and then cook all of our other vegetables separately and add them in to finish. Go ahead and heat up this burger.
Is there anything in the pot yet?
No, just very low heat. We're just going to heat up a little bit of oil for the onions.
And why are you doing that?
It helps them caramelize and you don't want them to stick. You just want enough to heat up and kind of coat the bottom of the pan. You don't really want to, I personally don't like a whole lot of oil in chilies or soups, or really honestly anything. I just feel like it's unnecessary and just kind of overly heavy. There's debate on whether or not you're supposed to wait for the oil to heat before adding the onions, but I've found that it doesn't really matter if you're going to caramelize anyways. Also, as far as knife techniques go, I'm fairly bad about this sometimes because I just like to expedite the process, but typically you want to work with a claw, because if you're doing this, the chances of you chopping your fingers off are a lot higher. If you haven't really worked with a chef's knife before, there's a lot of things I'll do where I'm kind of like working my fingers through, but that's because I'm really comfortable with it, and it's much better to just kind of work with this as a rule, just so that you keep yourself nice and safe and don't bleed all over your chili. There's not really any good way to not cry when you're cutting onions, unless you want to wear like masking goggles, but
I heard chewing gum helps, but that might be a kitchen myth.
I don't chew gum.
You don't chew gum?
I do not chew gum.
Is that a religious thing?
Gum is for suckers. Unless it's juicy fruit. That's alright.
Only
But that's only if you're playing basketball. Maybe baseball. Now we're just chopping up the garlic, similar kind of scenario. Just want to break them up into at least 3 pieces or so per clove. For this recipe, I like a lot of garlic. I think people are kind of afraid of it. They think garlic is really strong. That's partially true, but also like most great cooking has a fuck ton of garlic. French, Italian. That's why British food sucks. It doesn't have enough garlic. Frozen green chilies from Puebla, delicious. Then we're using 3 different kinds of chilies for this.
What's this first one here? Is this a pasilla?
Well, this is technically a pasillo.
Pasillo? Maybe some fresh quesadillas after that too.
Do you say fresh? Technically, this is a poblano pepper. Poblanos are sweet and smoky and a little bit spicy, which is why I love them. Similar to Puerto Ricans, which I have not had the chance to love a Puerto Rican yet, but we'll get there. So definitely like these. They add a really nice base, kind of add a smoky flavor. This is what turns into what is called an ancho chili after it's been sun-dried and toasted. Turns red. So you ever see ancho chili powder, you see ancho a lot in different marinades and such. So that's what the poblano starts as. So we're gonna use those, and then just some fresh green jalapenos, and then also these Anaheim chilies that I got from Pueblo. So we're gonna have, these are gonna be more kind of like sweet and a stronger base. The jalapenos are gonna bring heat and also kind of a bitterness. And then lastly, the Anaheim chilies are gonna add more of an acidity, so you're gonna have kind of a sour aspect. I always feel like Anaheim chilies taste a little bit like tomatillos, honestly. That's part of the reason they go so well together. Very low sugar content, it's very inky. Contrasting flavors are huge. You don't have to have them. There are a lot of styles of cuisine that I don't cook as often, or that I am not as into, that don't have nearly as many contrasting flavors. It's like a lot of rich on rich, like especially like Thanksgiving foods and such. I guess you have a little bit of sweet and salty going on, like cranberry sauce and turkey, things of that nature. But I feel like I really just like bright and powerful food. And so when you implement, like acid versus earthiness versus smokiness and sweetness, you get all of those things together. It's really beautiful. But I love to do that with vegetables as much as possible.
All right. What do we got here? Some sweet potatoes?
Yep, so I typically don't like to, you can do whatever you want, but I usually don't like to cook sweet potatoes in things so much because it's kind of hard to control the texture.
Interesting. So what are you gonna do instead?
So we're gonna oven roast these with their own spices, and then we're gonna, once they're very close to done, then we're gonna add them to the finished product of the chili. That way they have like a little bit of a kind of crispy edge to them. So we're gonna toss these in some oil, probably some cumin, coriander, chili powder, maybe a little bit of cinnamon. Cinnamon goes a long way, both cinnamon and clove go a long way in Latin cuisine. So
you're just gonna go with some nice big cubes on this one? You don't need to cut it up too thin or anything?
No, not really. Really, the only thing you want to eyeball when doing this is just imagining that you have a different cook time for things that are larger. So I kind of try and vary the sizes and the shapes, but not the size. So you figure, if it's a lot thinner, it's going to cook faster. If you have a larger piece like this, like for example, we have, let's see, a guy like this, very different shape from this, but they're approximately the same size. They're going to cook evenly. Preheating the oven to 400 degrees. I like to do 425 for standard potatoes, but because of, once again, the sugar content of a sweet potato, it has the tendency to burn, so I want to try to avoid that. A little forward about cooking potatoes, or sweet potatoes, anything like that. If you want everything to adhere properly, you don't want to cook them too soon before, you don't want to cut them too soon before you actually cook them. You're going to start to sweat. And as we know, oil and water don't mix. So if you're going to be coating these in oil and they start to sweat and they start to get really watery, it's going to be hard for the oil to adhere and then hence hard for the spices to adhere, and it's not going to cook quite as evenly or crisp up quite how we would like. I was trying to get all the oil, kind of coating them. You're going to get your hands messy. That's going to have to be okay.
Oh man, look at how juicy those are.
Oh yeah, look at that.
They're so cute.
All lubed up. So that's a great thing too. If you do not wash your hands and you don't touch any chilies, there's potential for a little bit of like side action at the end of the potatoes.
Oh, yeah.
You can see that? Ready to
Those
go.
are some foreplay
Waste
ready
not.
fingers.
Waste not. So you don't actually want to wash them. So instead, we're going to kind of sort through and try and get off any dirt possible, but we know that we're going to cook them at a high enough temperature that whatever is in the mushrooms will be completely fine, and there's never been anything wrong with eating dirt. So we're going to go fairly high oil in a separate pan, and basically just pan fry the mushrooms. I want to try and get a crispy texture on them as much as possible. We're going to see how that goes. That because of the compound makeup of mushrooms, you can't actually overcook them. Unless you cook them to like 600 degrees, they'll never overcook. So they can be undercooked and they can be over moisturized. So that's what we're going to try and avoid here.
There's also like some good basic logic that you passed down to me about it's good to cook things separately a lot of times because you want to make sure that everything tastes good on its own, correct?
Exactly. It gives you a little bit more control, it gives you more texture. You will also have less of a kind of symphony of ingredients that way, which if you end up adding like all of your ingredients together, the mushrooms are going to cook into the onions are going to cook into the mushrooms. So there can be an argument made for cooking everything together and stewing it for a long time because all of the flavor is going to emulsify. But I feel like if you end up implementing a lot of the same elements together and then you finish everything in the same broth, those elements will combine at the end. Alright, now you can see that simmering.
Pause that
It's
again.
getting a nice little sizzle.
Alright, what are we adding now?
So now we do want to get a little heat on our chilies beforehand. Try and caramelize those as well. Now that the onions are mostly done, we'll run those chilies with the onions and garlic. Kind of the same philosophy as making curry that we talked about before. Is that we're just very slowly trying to incorporate all the ingredients into one another, especially for the base. Cooking the mushrooms and the sweet potatoes separately, that's fine. That's going to be a big kind of flavor pop of its own that contrasts the chili itself. But for making this broth that we're going to puree, we kind of want to get everything to stick together as much as possible. So liberally salt these. You'd be surprised by how much salt you actually want on a potato. They soak it up like fucking mad. You see how these mushrooms are starting to brown. Nothing really happens if you under-season food. It's just the same thing that certain things like to be salted before, certain things like to be salted after.
Or during.
And yeah, exactly. And it'll bring out more of the flavor. The sweet potatoes, it'll just taste better. Salt kind of like activates your palate. That's why almost all food is salted.
What are you putting in there? Is that cumin?
Cumin, yeah, cumin. You can be pretty liberal with cumin. If you like the flavor of it, you can go pretty heavy. That's what I'm doing here. And ground cumin, always know that whole spices are going to be much stronger than ground spices. That has to do with the age. A lot of the aromatics and everything break down over time, which is why if you're making curry paste, that's why if we ever do a curry video, I always like to start with raw spices, toast and aromatize those. Those we're going to run for 35 minutes. It was a little bit heavy, but I think that because of the way that we're cooking this, we'll start with 30, see how that goes, but I assume we're probably going to need another 5. This is basically our meat right here.
That's interesting. I think that's something we should emphasize. So yeah, it's like, if you want that savory sort of meat element into your vegan dish, mushrooms can be a pretty good alternative, you're saying?
Excellent alternative. Mushrooms are one of the most savory things on the planet. They don't have the exact same meaty texture. They're pretty close though. I mean, it's not like the texture of mushroom is the same as the texture of a steak, but the way that it chews and the way that the fibers break down, it's satisfying in a similar way to eating animal proteins. Alright, now that we're getting those chilies kind of cooked down here, we're going to start to add the rest of our ingredients for what will turn into the broth. And once these green chilies are thawed into the mix, we're going to add the broth and the rest of the spices. Now we're going to hit these, now that you can see that these are all kind of glistening.
Smell really good.
I'm going to go ahead and turn that heat all the way up.
All the way on high?
Yeah, and try and crisp them up a little bit. You can see when you kind of get the heat level right with something like this, nothing ever really sticks. Because the more the onions release water and absorb oil, the more there's a coating on the bottom of the pan. You can eventually overdo this, but essentially no matter what, nothing is sticking to the bottom of the pan. If you're concerned whatsoever about the health of your food, which usually when I try to batch cook like this, I typically try to use as many complementary and healthy ingredients as possible. There are certain things that don't really get much better with a long period of cooking. Things like mushrooms get a really awesome texture and their flavor enhances the longer you cook them. And they don't really break down much, but fresher vegetables such as bell peppers, although you may prefer the way that they are texturally if they're all soft and mushy, they maintain all their vitamins and minerals much better if you don't overcook them. So I try to add things like that, and as well as like spinach or greens or kale, which we're gonna add later. I try not to cook those too much, so these are really just going to go in at the finish. But it doesn't hurt to get them chopped up ahead of time so that we're ready as soon as the broth is ready to go.
By cutting off that top.
Yeah, I just want to remove the stem. This opens things up. As soon as you cut that, you can see that the stem just falls out clean, and you're left with all of the top.
Still all usable. I see people throwing away that top. They just cut up the top, gut it, and then throw it away, and it's like, that's all usable pepper right there, though.
Exactly. So I like to kind of get about the same size chunks, and then essentially we're just going to carefully try and remove the ribs here. Just kind of glide along the outside of this. And then we're basically just going to pluck out this core and get the seeds out. You leave the seeds in, but it doesn't really enhance the flavor whatsoever.
Not like jalapenos where it leaves in heat.
Yeah, exactly. They don't really have very much flavor. I like to try and remove the ribs as much as possible. So you can see, you just reach in and kind of pluck those out.
Those just don't taste very good.
No, and it's not very nice texturally either. And then essentially we're just going to go right down the center, and then quarter once again. And then we're just going to take one of those quarters. I'm going to say 1, 2, and 3 cuts. Divide that into quarters again, and then rotate, and then just essentially coin from here. Doesn't really matter the size all that much. That really is just preferential. So now you can see how these mushrooms are starting to crisp up. That's what we're looking for right there. These are reduced. They're basically just little flavor packets right now. Almost all the water is cooked out. And that's going to give them the opportunity to rehydrate later on. So we've left these here at high heat for quite some time. And remember what I mentioned earlier about mushrooms not overcooking? You can just see how they just keep sweating and keep sweating and keep sweating. They're just getting crispier and crispier. They're not sticking or burning, which is exactly what we want. So let those go a few more minutes. And then we're going to start on our broth here. You can tell that this Most of the green chilies are melted into our little concoction here.
And this is the base for the broth, then, right?
Yeah, this is the base. Yeah, exactly. This is the base. So to this, we're just going to add vegetable stock as well as tomato paste. We're going to add our beans later on.
So this really is more like a stew because you're not like super heavy on the tomato then.
Exactly, yeah.
Like usually chili is like, I mean, probably like 60% tomato paste and shit.
Yeah, that whole like American chili bullshit. This is, I call it chili because it has a lot of chilies in it, a lot of the elements of chili. So
Adding that vegetable stock.
3 quarts of vegetable stock. Now we're going to turn up our heat because we immediately want this to reach a boil. Whenever possible, purchasing any ingredients that have additives or corn syrup. If you buy a really budget tomato paste, you'll notice that it usually is sweetened with corn syrup or a lot of sugar. Really, you just want true tomato paste, just tomatoes and water. Roma tomatoes and citric acid, so that's all it has. It's just a preservative, a natural preservative at that, which is just going to add a little bit of sourness, which we're totally cool with. Try and get all of that out of here. And stir our knife around, finish up things off. Try and get it clean. See these bits that are starting to get crispy? We don't want those guys getting any more done. Some of these are a little bit more or less done. But some of that blackness that we have going on right there, that caramelization, that's what we want.
That's like borderline perfect.
Yeah. See that guy?
Yeah.
That's what you want to get. And you notice they're about 1/3 of the size as when we started.
Yeah, that's true.
So we're going to go ahead and kill the heat on those mushrooms and then add our spices to the broth. There we go. There's our chili powder. So we're going to do 2 tablespoons of chili powder.
People that aren't a fan of heat, they might want to refrain from this, I'm guessing.
Or just use mild. Mild chili powder has a good flavor to it. I'm using medium, so it's going to be a little bit more spicy. I think really what's going to be adding a lot of heat to this is the choice we did in peppers.
Yeah.
If you don't work with that, it's going to be a lot easier on you. And we also want more of our trusty cumin. This we're going to do 1 tablespoon of. This is already in the chili powder, so we don't need to up it quite as much. And to brighten everything up, I really like to use coriander, which is essentially the same thing as cilantro, but it's the seed instead of the actual the leaf. So we don't have any ground coriander, but we're going to use whole coriander seed. And this will be fine because we're going to puree it anyways. Do a tablespoon of that as well. And then lastly, we're going to add kind of the sort of backbone to this by doing a little bit of cinnamon and a little bit of clove. You want to be really careful with this. It sounds weird as hell, but you know, Mexican grandma cooked for you, you start to realize just how amazing it is. So we're going to do just a 1/4 teaspoon here with the cloves.
Interesting. That's something that most people wouldn't think about putting in a stew or a chili.
However, if you think about it, as far as the backgrounds of spices go, cloves are actually very, very similar to black pepper. They have a very similar aromatic quality. They just often get used in baking, so we don't think of using them the same way.
Right.
1/4 teaspoon of this as well.
Love the cinnamon.
We're going to go ahead and, just for good measure, see what the broth tastes like. And just see if it's close. Well, we're going to need to figure out exactly how much salt we want to add. Probably a pretty liberal amount given all the vegetables in here. There's a lot of water content.
Close?
Yeah, got the smokiness, got the aromatics, so we're just going to want some salt to pull it out. It's not awfully hot right now, so I am going to go ahead and add the chili to our bowl. It's going to be over here actually. Just picked it up from the Mexican market, so hasn't made its way into the old spice jar yet. El Guapo, which means the handsome chili.
Oh yeah.
And because this doesn't matter so much, I'm going to eyeball it. That was approximately a tablespoon. I would say probably like 2/3 of a tablespoon, in other words, 2 teaspoons. So now at this point, really, everything is just waiting. We're gonna wait for this to simmer. We want that to simmer for probably 30 minutes or so, just to emulsify all the flavors, and then we're gonna puree it. And then when we finish, we're going to add our sweet potatoes, our mushrooms, our bell peppers, and our kale all together and just let it cook for about 5 minutes until the kale is appropriately wilted and the bell peppers are tender, and then we're going to be good.
Alright, so a little over 30 minutes has gone by. Steven turned off the oven. Those potatoes are probably cooked. We can probably check them in a second.
Yes, indeed.
That was on a boil for that much time, and then he turned it down to about a simmer, I want to say, right?
Yeah, very low simmer. Basically, I just wanted to get it low enough that it's not boiling so it doesn't splash me when I do this. So if you don't have one of these, you can use something else, or really you can just leave all this whole and chop the ingredients a little bit better. This is an immersion blender. They're super cheap, very easy to clean, and this is essentially just going to puree the majority of what we have here. And you can kind of do this preferentially. You can puree it all the way until 100% smooth, or you can just kind of go in a direction that everything is kind of salsa texture, if that makes sense.
What do you prefer for this dish?
You know, for me, I'm probably going to go short of a puree. Doesn't really matter. I just know that, you know, if you get a huge clove of garlic in one bite and you get an entire green chili in another, it's going to be kind of a pain in the ass to eat. You can kind of tell this is chunky a little bit. There's some chunks sitting around in here. I want to try and kind of get rid of most of those if we can. But that's basically good. And we're going to do this a little bit longer, but we need to add our salt now. So we're going to just kind of season to taste. We're going to go with a heavy tablespoon of salt to start. And just kind of work this back in with the mixer. And then see where we're at and see if we need to add more salt.
Pretty hot.
Yeah, it's a little hot. Pretty high acidity right now. But really tasty. I think we're going to add just a little bit more salt. I'll probably just do a teaspoon here. And then I think because of the high level of acidity here, you never really know with the chilies or tomatoes that you're working with how acidic it's going to be. We're actually going to add a little bit of sugar to this just to balance everything out. So I'm going to get some agave nectar, because that just seems to make sense. I'm just going to kind of eyeball here, but we're going to go probably, this is going to be approximately a tablespoon.
So I've seen agave more at, like, you know, cafes and tea bars and stuff like that. What is agave? Is it like a leaf?
It's essentially just the sugar of basically a cactus called agave. It's the same thing that tequila is made from. So anything that can turn into alcohol needs to have sugar.
Right.
So it's kind of like a syrup, just the same thing as maple, but it comes from a cactus. A little bit less flavorful, but it's really tasty. It's definitely like more bright. That's good.
That's where you want it?
Yeah, it's all balanced out now. Sometimes it's the same thing with like salt and sugar. Sometimes you just need to balance those two. And if you have acidity, sometimes you can bat it with sugar. If something just doesn't seem as flavorful as you want it to be, you can bat that with salt.
Oh man, can I just do one of those motherfuckers?
Absolutely. Whichever one you like.
I'll grab that one. That was nice. Oh baby. Oh. I've been snacking those motherfuckers all day.
So, and go our sweet potatoes. So now we got all of those mixed in here. We got our mushrooms. Now we're gonna add our kale. It's gonna reduce down, it looks like a lot, but we love a lot of kale. It's gonna add some bitterness to the dish too, and a really nice texture.
This is what I thought last time, because last time I saw you put have to stuff it all in, and I'm like, damn dude, that's a lot of kale, but it actually like gets compressed and mixes in like really good, and like you said, adds like a really nice counter of bitterness to it. I don't know.
And it's always just nice to have some greens and something kind of freshen it up.
Kale's like it's considered a superfood too, isn't it? Isn't it just packed with nutrients?
Yeah, it is one of the most nutrient-dense greens in the world. You can cook the hell out of it too. You can make kind of almost like a wilted kind of kale greens. You can make kale salad. There's a lot of different things you can do with it. This is already chopped, but if you start with fresh kale, you don't really need to worry about chopping, or you will need to worry about chopping it. You can see how much that just already broke down inside.
Yeah.
So we're just gonna kind of like try and turn the kale and make less of a mess than I'm making right now. Slowly turn everything in, fold it. And the last thing we're gonna do here is turn up the heat just to do that last 5 minutes of cooking that we talked about, as well as add our beans. And just try to get everything to kind of marry together happily. Oh yeah, there it is.
Yeah, that you cut it real close for that. Let me get a different angle of that.
Bell pepper cascade. See, just perfect getting in there. Would you like to be fed a spoonful?
Sure.
Let's try this. Get you some kale, some beans in there. There we go. Got that.
Oh my.
Smoky, spicy.
No man,
Right.
so much going on there.
See how that cinnamon and clove do a lot there?
Yeah,
Barely notice it's in there, but now knowing that it's in there, you're like, fuck yeah.
Gotta clean that spoon.
And that was Rhett's actual application for a dating profile, ladies. See that tongue work?
See anything on that spoon? There's nothing.
So clean, but so dirty.
Oh yeah.
We're mincing up some cilantro. If you like cilantro, use a whole bunch. That's what I'm doing. Doesn't really need to be that finely chopped, but you know, sometimes you get a bit of a spaghetti situation with cilantro if you don't chop it, so we're trying to avoid that. And now that everything is in there, bell peppers are going to continue cooking just because the liquid is hot. I like to leave those nice and fresh so that they stay kind of crispy. Once again, keep the nutrient content. Now we're just going to kill the heat, add our fresh herbs, and we are donezo. Yeah, that is our delicious chili. Whole pot full, but not quite overflowing.
Cheers.
Cheers, homie.
What do ladies say after you're like, I'll cook for you, and then you cook them something this fucking bomb? Are they just
usually,
like, go ahead and take me to the room bedroom or what?
About half the time, yeah.